But the big collect the data, and then we really work closely with a lot of our stakeholders and partners like the Forest Service, like the Minnesota DNR, to apply the results of our research to management action, to change conservation plans. And so I'll be talking about some of that stuff today as well. So for a big picture context, I think it's always really important to think about, we're in an era where we're losing a lot of biodiversity, and that's globally, and there is really no place in the world that's not seeing a tremendous loss of biodiversity. Species in these different ecosystems, the ecosystem functions the way it's meant to, right? And we have these positive species interactions, and we start losing individual species, even if they're not that abundant, or you know, they're relatively rare. We don't know the overall consequence of sort of unraveling this network of ecosystem function. And that's sort of what we're focusing a lot in science on, you know, these days, to prevent that loss of species, and then also to figure out how to make it more robust and resilient into the future as we continue to deal with all these changes that are happening in the world. There's a recent paper that basically says, gosh, habitat loss is still a major threat to biodiversity, and that's pretty much across taxa, so birds, mammals, reptiles. It's habitat loss, it's habitat degradation, invasive species, conversion to, you know, suburbs, filling in of wetlands, all this stuff that we've been talking about for really decades and decades. You know, a lot of good has happened, especially this is a results from a paper that was published in Nature a while back, but we can see that there's wetlands bird species have really increased in the past about 40 years. And that's because we focused a lot on ducks, right? We put a lot of money into restoring wetlands because of Ducks Unlimited. It was really awesome because we thought about it in terms of water quality. And so when we really focus on habitat restoration, habitat conservation, we can see an increase in bird species that rely on it. But unfortunately, meanwhile, we've dropped the ball on a lot of other habitats and bird species that rely on those habitats. We're seeing pretty big decreases in bird species across the board in everywhere else, really, except for wetland habitat. But the work that we do here in Minnesota is really important because Minnesota is one of the most diverse, is the home to one of the most diverse breeding bird communities in all of North America. And we'll talk a lot about some of those bird species today. Just because, you know, applied research is a little bit maybe weird or to think about, even just research in general is kind of weird to think about if you don't live in that world. I've put together this sort of cycle of applied research just so it kind of makes sense of some of the things that we're going to talk about. But essentially, you know, we focus on bird ecology and species conservation. And so the first thing that we do is we talk a lot to our partners and we think about, well, you know, what are some of the things that they're seeing? What are some issues with certain species? And we use data to assess the information and identify issues. Now we're so blessed really to have Jerry's long-term monitoring data for these national forests, but he also has a bunch of monitoring data for coastal wetlands and bird species there as well, because we can just look at that data and look at some of the trends and habitat relationships for species that we might be concerned about or want to learn more about. What we then do is say, okay, well, what are the research gaps? What are some priorities that we need to inform management across a landscape or at even a stand level? We do the research and collect the data, which is, you know, depending on the project, at least 2 years. Costs a lot of money, very hard, very intense field situation. Then we analyze the data. We try and summarize it in a way that's meaningful. And the biggest part is that we then circle back to outreach and feedback with our partners and stakeholders and try and make that research that we've done as impactful as possible. So we're changing habitat management, conserving conservation plans to really make sure that we're keeping biodiversity on the ground. And what we do that's good for birds is generally good for a lot of other taxa, including insects, small mammals, even large mammals too. And sort of the way that we look at it, the goals are we want to keep common bird species common. And then we also put a particular focus on species of interest, of conservation interest. And so today I'll be talking a lot about species that are designated as species in greatest conservation need. That's a designation given by the Minnesota DNR that basically takes into account a lot of different federal management plans, but also local issues that are going on. And we sort of use that to help us think about kind of the canary in the coal mine sort of an approach. So I'm going to go to this what's called a story map, which is more of an interactive kind of a PowerPoint presentation. And it's the first time I've done this on Zoom, so hopefully it's not terrible. But also the link is available if anybody, actually I'll stick it in the chat right now, if you're a person that likes to click around and listen at the same time, you can actually go visit this link that I just put in the chat and interact with it after the presentation or during if you want. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the National Forest Breeding Bird Program. It was started in the early 90s. Most of the data that we're talking about is from 1995 to 2021. So this past year, we're just revving up for our 2022 field season. We use that data because it was collected in a similar manner consistently throughout. And so that's a really long time to be doing monitoring. And it's so awesome that the Chippewa National Forest and the Superior National Forest see so much value in this monitoring program, because a lot of agencies don't monitor because it takes time, it takes effort, it takes consistency, but the data that we get from it is becoming more and more valuable, literally by the minute. So here's just an overview map of the forest, right? So the green is forests habitat. And you can see in Minnesota, yep, there's a lot of forests. And if you're familiar, the Superior National Forest is up in here, Chippewa is through here. And so it's really the heart of these forests. And what's great about the National Forest too is that they have management plans that are for multi-benefit use. So they're not managing just for timber, although they do manage for timber, but also for wildlife and for recreation. And we have trails that we can use and the public can enjoy all that. And so they're really comprehensive. And basically the way that they manage the forest represents kind of a best case scenario for a lot of bird in the state. And so if we're looking at them and we're able to monitor sort of the best case scenario, we can learn a lot what might be going on across other land managements, private lands, county lands, state lands, that sort of thing. All right, so as I mentioned in the previous slide, the Western Great Lakes region has one of the richest species diversity in all of North America. And the National Forest is one of the largest land ownerships in the area too. And it is so diverse because we have this transition between that eastern deciduous kind of forest, and then we're getting into some of the more coniferous boreal type forests as we go north in the state. So Jerry, in all of his infinite wisdom, knew that there was a lot of concern about forest management and how it was affecting bird species in the early 90s or late 80s, early 90s. And so he was able to establish this really large scale monitoring project. And what's really unique about it is that it's totally off-road and it's habitat specific. We're getting really local and high quality data, and it complements some other survey methods that a lot of other states use, like the breeding bird surveys, which are volunteer based, but they're roadside. And so you're not getting maybe some of those habitats like we have in Minnesota, like the lowland conifer swamps that go, that you have to really go off road for, but that's where a lot of our species diversity is too. So currently we have more than 350 stands, which is over 1,000 points. So our researchers go to over 1,000 points each year in the 2 national forests, and we survey them in a relatively short amount of time when the birds are most active, at least singing and doing their breeding behavior from June 1st to July 10th, but we try not to go too far into July. And we collect data by doing a standardized 10-minute point count. For those of you that might not be familiar with what a point count is, basically we navigate, again, off-road. There's no trails, there's not really any markers, just using a GPS to these locations that, again, were established in the early 90s. And we stand there for 10 minutes with a counter, and we go through a lot of training because there's a lot of birds and you have to estimate distance, and we try and do everything we can to standardize the data collection. But basically we're standing in the middle of this circle and we're writing down every bird species that we hear. Over 90% of our detections are auditory, meaning we either hear a bird singing or calling. And we try to keep track of birds that might be moving and not double count them. And then we're also simultaneously estimating the distance from us that they might be singing, which again is tricky and it takes a lot of training. But that's what a 10-minute point count is. And it sounds maybe simple, but it is very, very challenging. And if you've ever been out, in June in the forest, you know how many birds are singing at any given time. But so we do those point counts as the primary data collection method. Really what we wanted to do and what we continue to do is to establish the inventory of local forest breeding birds. And we look at this data in a lot of different ways, including communities and habitat specialists. And but I'm going to again focus on species of conservation interest today. And then what we can also do with this data, because it's so long-term, is look at population changes. And again, there's not a lot of data sets that allow us to look at habitat-specific population changes. And so it's very unique to this particular monitoring program. And then we think about, well, what do these trends mean? And complete that circle that I was talking about and work with the National Forest to sort of say, okay, well, what might this, what forest management activities could improve or might be affecting this, or what's great about them. And so that's sort of here's a map of all of our point counts. Again, you can kind of, if you go to that link, you can zoom in and see how they are distributed, but they were distributed systematically across the cover types that are available in the forest. So since 1995, we have conducted 25,000 10-minute point counts, which is an incredible number, right? And this past year alone, we surveyed 353 stands, 1,022 survey points in the National Forest. So altogether, we have detected, written down, seen, heard, whatever, 409,000 individual birds. And this number is remarkable, of 166 bird species. 166 bird species have been detected in Minnesota's national forests over these past few decades. That's an incredible number. You think about like the tropics and you go and there's species there and that's where they are. They're also right here in Minnesota. It's pretty amazing. A lot of those species are very, very common and are detected in a lot of areas throughout the forest, and others, of course, are rare and more sparsely dispersed. And some species come and go in the state and aren't really detected consistently as well. This is a graph of the individuals that we detect per point count. And the blue is the Chippewa National Forest and the red is the Superior National Forest. And then sort of the regional is what we call it, is the green, it's the middle. It's sort of if we combine the two. And you can see that there's a general increase in birds from 1995 to the mid 2000s. And then it sort of started to go down, and now it's kind of been bouncing around for the past few years. We think this increase had a lot to do with the changes in forest management that were happening at that time. And honestly, I'm not entirely sure what was going on or why there's a lot of decreases, but we'll talk about some of the species and the general patterns that we're seeing here. But we were glad back here, which is sort of when Jerry started to retire and I took over, that they didn't keep on tanking, because that would have been a bad way to start my job, right? So again, if you go to the website, this is just looking at sort of the species richness and the average abundance of the combined point counts. You can zoom in and see areas, you know, if you have a lake cabin somewhere and you want to look at some of that summary data, it might be fun. But first I'll just start talking about the trends in Chippewa National Forest, and again with a special focus on those species of conservation concern, or SGCNs is how we abbreviate it, or how the Minnesota DNR abbreviates it, I guess. So in 2021, we were able to analyze population trends. So how abundant are they over time for 69 species. In Chippewa, there were 18 species positively increasing. And so an increasing trend looks like this, where since 1995, they've been going up pretty consistently. And that have showed that pattern. And then we had 34 species that were relatively stable, so it would go more across than these graphs here. And notably, there are so the Canada warbler is this guy. It happens to be one of my favorite birds, and they're relatively common around Duluth. And they're super cool because they are both habitat specialists and generalists at the same time. They use a lot of different cover types, but they really like a shrub layer. And so they like to have, there's forests that are maybe relatively young or really old forests that have gaps and have the shrubs in them as well. In Chippewa, there's been a lot of, they're doing thinnings of the stands and some wind damage, and they're just loving these management techniques that they're using, or they're not clear cutting an entire stand, but basically leaving a good mix of mature trees and then opening up the canopy so the shrub layer comes in. And so we're seeing a pretty big increase of those guys there, which is great because they're declining across the range, and particularly in Canada. So so that's, I think we have some pretty strong evidence that what certain forest techniques do or can benefit for this particular bird. This is, again, if you go to the link, I have it linked to the Minnesota Breeding Bird Atlas, which if you love birds is an amazing resource that Jan and Jerry and Lee Van Mueller have put together. It's awesome. And hopefully you all know about the book that's soon coming out that they've been working on for years and years, and it's going to be an amazing resource, and everybody should look forward to getting it. And I hope we can have a big party for when it's released, because it's going to be tremendous. So, but there's a link to the breeding bird distribution of Canada warbler, and this will take you to the Minnesota Breeding Bird Atlas website. Here is the second one that was significantly increasing. Look at how cute that is. So this video is actually from one of our other studies that's sort of focused on some of these birds, so we can learn more about it. That's a female veery feeding a chick, and I don't know if you can tell, but the chick, the chick has a transmitter on, and so we were following them around to figure out what habitats they use after they leave the nest. We were also just able to capture some really cool videos. So these veery, they have really high density in Minnesota. A lot of their breeding population is there. They like young forests, but they like sort of the older end of young forests, and they really like aspen stands. They nest in these shrubs, and so they are really important, or so those features are really important for them. But one of the big things is that they're sensitive to fragmentation. And so if we don't think about how the forest is being managed on larger scales, it can be a real issue for them. But these birds really common, again, in the area, and they're curious and will come and kind of look you in the eye when you're in the forest, which is always nice to see a friendly bird. And here, as you can see, the veery is much more widely distributed than the Canada warbler was. There's a lot of them. And so they're a really good canary in the coal mine because we can get a lot of data on them. Their population statistics are really like sort of easy to analyze and look at, and they're also sensitive to those habitat changes. So they are one of my favorite species as well. Now, so for the bad news, so 17 species have significantly declined in Chippewa National Forest in 2021, and 3 of them were of conservation concern: Connecticut warbler, olive-sided flycatcher, and then winter wren. And you can see these trends are just sort of really consistently bombing negative, and that's not great. Connecticut warbler is the species I am most concerned about as a avian ecologist and person that loves birds. They're really, really, since I've been around and working with Jerry and in the National Forest in the past 10 years, they've gone from being like relatively consistent to see at certain areas to we don't see them at all. I think it was 2018 was the first year they did not detect any Connecticut warblers on the monitoring point counts. And then in 2019, 2020, and 2021, we've sort of had 1 or 2 kind of pop in some of the Chippewa stands. But they are a very rare species, I guess you would say, for a forest bird. They really love lowland conifer forests, so both tamarack, black spruce trees. And the thing about them is they're really structural specialists. So they like mature trees, but they also have to have these kind of openings as well. And so we also know that they like really big chunks of those habitats. And if you're aware of any of the forest issues that are going on, we have a lot of a native pest called eastern larch beetle that's killing a ton of tamarack. And then there's climate change issues with maybe some of the quality of the stands of those lowland conifers. And unfortunately, one of the ways that we manage black spruce is by clear cutting them. And so there's that basically takes habitat away from the species for 50 years until they start to regenerate. And so I think we're seeing this being the canary of the in the coal mine for a lot of different issues that many bird species are experiencing, but this one we're seeing it really in a short amount of time. And again, you can see Connecticut warbler sort of sparsely observed in the BBA. It would be really interesting to go back to some of these points where they were observed and see that are outside of the national forest and see if they're still there. I know in Wisconsin, they tried that and they did not see any Connecticut warblers that were observed even just 5 years ago. So we're working on a lot of different studies to figure out what we can do for those guys to keep them in this state and conserve biodiversity. This guy is the olive-sided flycatcher. He's sort of got this mohawk situation happening and is really an exciting bird to hear in the forest. They also like lowland conifer forests, and they are flycatchers. And so they like a perch to sit on, and then they'll go and catch the flies. So they like to have it an open area, and then they bring it back to the perch they're sitting on and eat it. It's called sallying. Anyway, so they like that they have to have a structure of the forest that's both open and has trees. And so they're oftentimes found in areas that have been harvested or disturbed in some way, but have snags and or a lot of tree retention. Sometimes riparian areas, you'll see them. We think that habitat loss and degradation is probably an issue with the olive-sided flycatcher. Again, this species is at the southern part of the range in Minnesota, and so climate change and habitat quality is probably an issue. But you can see it's, again, very sparsely distributed across the northern part of the state. Winter wrens is also one of my favorites. Have I said that about all the birds? Probably. So winter wren, if you guys have ever heard of winter wren, they're amazing. They're unmistakable. Sort of messy and sort of leaves a forest that looks older than it is, maybe would be really beneficial for these guys. They're not decreasing across their range, but they have been in Minnesota, and so I'm hopeful there's a lot of forest management techniques that we can use to bring their populations back up. The Superior National Forest, we were able to analyze trends for 67 species. Of those, 13 had significantly increasing and 29 had stable. So that's a pretty good chunk of them were, you know, were in the good news category, I guess. 2 of those that were increasing are Cape May warbler and purple finch. And those are these guys here. The Cape May warbler is a really interesting bird because it's considered a spruce budworm specialist. And so if any of you guys have taken a trip up the shore at all, you've noticed that there are a lot of standing dead conifer trees. There's been a spruce budworm outbreak in varying levels of intensity sort of across the Arrowhead region since like 2010, I would say, I think is what our data says. But since that, we've kind of seen this big response. You can sort of see where they were generally low levels, and then spruce budworm came along and they're like, hey, it's delicious here, and sort of have been coming back and increasing in numbers. And this is a great thing to see too, because then you're like, wow, our monitoring program's really working. And it was really picking up on this really great signal. As a lot of the spruce budworm infestation sort of tapers off, and a lot of our stands will probably see this trend level off in the next few years. But having conifer stands that are healthy across the landscape and increasing the conifer component in our forests is going to be really important for this species, and a bunch of other ones that Tennessee warbler, Blackburnian warbler even, that are really like these conifer areas will benefit from just thinking about diversifying our stands and having more conifer. Again, here you can see the Cape May. We see them most consistently in Superior National Forest, and every once in a while in Chippewa, but the Superior National Forest is a place to be if you're going to go try and see a Cape May warbler. Purple finch is an interesting bird. They use a variety of habitats as well, including my backyard, which is fun. They have had pretty consistent population declines across their range, but in Minnesota, or specifically in Superior National Forest, they've been increasing. There are some studies in Ontario or in Canada that show that purple finch populations have declined when spruce budworm populations
Hello, folks. You guys can hear me, correct?
We can.
Okay.
I'm back. Sorry, I somehow got booted out.
We do keep cutting in and out every once in a while.
I
So
do.
yeah.
I'm sorry about that.
It's you know, it happens.
I think if people shut off their videos, that sometimes helps with the bandwidth for her.
Yeah, I might shut off my video as well too, if that's okay with everybody, and just be the voice in the box.
That usually helps.
Thanks, Martha. Well, I don't know exactly when. I think I was talking about conifer trees and purple finch, and basically purple finch are pretty widely distributed throughout the state. Again, they like that conifer component, and mixed sort of habitats. And so that's important to think about as climate change continues to sort of affect our landscape. The bad news for Superior National Forest is that we have 25 species that have significantly decreasing trends, and 4 of them are species of greatest conservation need. The first is the black-billed cuckoo. So the black-billed cuckoo is a really interesting bird that is widely distributed and even likes to hang out in the riparian areas in the southern edge of the state, and likes forest edges, likes pastures, like shrubby wetlands. Oftentimes we see them in stands that have had a tent caterpillar sort of outbreak or ongoing infestation even if it's just low levels. They've been decreasing across their range. And so I think Minnesota is just also seeing that. Some of the reasons they think they're decreasing have to do with the fact that they're insect eaters and they maybe pesticides, maybe water issues. We really need to study the species a little bit more than we don't know a ton about the details and their like post-breeding ecology, for example, how long they stay in the state after they nest, that sort of thing. Connecticut warbler was decreasing again in Superior National Forest, just like in Chippewa National Forest, which is again a pretty big bummer. Eventually, we won't even be able to run trends on the Connecticut warbler because we just won't have enough data about them in the current time. But this is again something that we need to keep our eye on and may be the biggest or the most threatened bird in the state at this point, in my opinion. Evening grosbeak is a species, you know, I hear a lot of people from to do with forestry and forest
Hey, Jeff.
Hello, I think we're working stuff out here.
Uh,
I think looks like Alexis is not with us any longer.
is she far away?
No, she thought she might have some bandwidth
Uh,
issues. You know, till the kids get off Netflix, things like that. So we'll see
How many are still with us here?
if she's able to rejoin.
Oh, everybody's still here.
It's hard to tell sometimes, you know, if it's, you know, on my end or their end or whatever. So
Jeff,
It's a great presentation.
hi, Gene.
I got a question while we're waiting for Alexis to re-up. A thing I've noticed is by the way, we have the evening grosbeaks out here north of Island Lake. But we usually have pine siskins, and for the last 2 years, they're gone. Anybody else noticed that you know of? Did you get that?
Yeah. I feel like I've noticed fewer pine siskins, you know, except during migration. But otherwise in winter, I am not seeing very many. Oh, myself, anybody else?
I've noticed some during the Christmas bird count. I saw some, and then also about a week ago or so, or week and a half ago, in my backyard, there was a small flock of them.
But they don't seem common, like they don't seem as frequent as they used to be.
Yeah, that I wouldn't know. I'm new to the area.
And not in numbers like they used to be, I would say.
No.
I'd like to ask Alexis if she thinks that that spraying for gypsy moths is affecting the black-billed cuckoo population by poisoning a lot of the fruit they eat.
Well, this is Jerry Nemi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, Alexis lives up by, I don't know if she's at home, and she lives up by the Leicester River, so that could be a possibility if she's a little bit farther away.
Yeah.
Anyway, that both, the questions about evening grosbeaks and pine siskins, they fall in that category of nomadic finches, and they're really difficult to study because of that. They're up and down. One year there'll be, tens of them in your yard or whatever, and then the next year they're gone. So they're very, very difficult species to study. So it's going to be hard. It's be difficult. Now the question about gypsy moth, I'm not aware of any direct studies looking at gypsy moth and effects on black-billed cuckoos. But if you could see the fine writing that Alexis had on the slide, there's a suspicion that application of some of these insecticides may be affecting the species of black-billed cuckoo. That could be actually countrywide or North American wide. So there is something going on with black-billed cuckoos, which is problematic. And if I was guessing, I would say probably some insecticides might be a problem.
Well, Jerry, I think it makes me wonder because the moth snowstorm doesn't happen anymore in the Midwest like it used to, and the fact that we have these every year there are these routine flyover spray of the forests around Duluth, and I don't know how far up the shore they go, but it certainly makes you wonder that that poison can have some effect on the species that eat the insects that are being killed.
Dr. Grinde
Yes,
is back with us here.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry, for taking over,
Okay.
filling in.
You can have it back.
Yeah, I'm really sorry about the internet, guys. I was done though with all of the species, and so I don't know if you guys were able to ask any questions. Sounds like you're talking about black-billed cuckoos, but I'd be happy. I can't see the chat anymore, but I'd be happy to take any questions. But before we do that, I just wanted to bring your attention to some really awesome bird events that are happening in the state that might be of interest to bird lovers such as yourselves. The Bell Museum has an exhibit called Seeing Birds, and it's now through October 2nd, and it sounds really great. And I'm giving a talk with them next week about some of the technologies we use to track birds. So if you're interested in that, check out their website. And then this we talked about actually last year, and now it's actually coming to fruition, but we work a lot with the Great Lakes Audubon group, and we've been working to collect bird data across the St. Louis River estuary, and we're hoping to get some citizens that love birding and would like to contribute to the data set to basically adopt a area in the St. Louis River. And I have this link to a Google Doc that you can come and take a look at. But basically, we've identified target sites that we would love people to adopt, like you do, maybe if you've ever participated in a breeding bird atlas or something. And, ideally survey them once a week or just whenever you want to get out and go birding and are looking for a reason to get down to the river. These are really great areas to see a lot of different wetland, marsh species, Hiram as well. And basically the gist is you'll enter it into eBird using a hotspot location. And let's see, Tom Presby from the Great Lakes Audubon is going to be kind of leading that. But if you have any questions or interested in participating or learning more, that would be great. And I'll just stick this link in the chat for everybody, if hopefully it'll work. And you can take a look at some of those details. And then lastly, some of you know that I am one of the more recent board members for Hawk Ridge Bird Observatory, which is a great place to see birds in Duluth. And they're coming up on their 50-year celebration. And so that is September 22nd through the 25th. And if you're interested in helping plan or specifically looking interested in maybe sponsorship opportunities, feel free to contact me or Janelle Long. Her email is there, but hopefully you guys can come for this 3-day event. It starts on the Thursday, the 22nd with a fancy gala, and there's a whole bunch of presentations, and it's going to be really fun. So I'll put that on your calendars so you don't accidentally go on vacation and miss all the fun in September. But yes, with that, then I would love to take any questions that you guys have. And again, I apologize for the internet situation.
Any questions?
Bob Taman in Sudan again. I guess one question I thought of, they're doing a lot of surveys in the National Forest, and I know there's a lot of private and corporate ownership within the boundaries of our national forest. Matter of fact, my wife Pat and I have a little private inholding in the Superior National Forest. I wonder if those inholdings are part of the survey, because some of them are pretty large.
They are not. Our surveys are specific to like the actual national forest land. But we do take into account, when we do habitat modeling for different species, some of those land ownerships. But if anybody ever wants us to go on their land, we'd probably love to do surveys there, just because it would be interesting to see if it's never been managed or hasn't been managed in the past 50 years, if there's any differences.
Well, I hope I'm not getting off the subject or anything, but I think this is interesting because when we were doing the breeding bird atlas in Minnesota, that must be 10 years ago or more. I believe Steve Wilson from Tower was doing our area, and he managed to get access to one of our mining companies' reclaimed areas, and he was finding prairie birds in the reclaimed tailings area, dump areas. And so it surprised me a little bit that those prairie birds would find their way all the way up to close to the Babbitt area. And so there's more interesting research to do out there. Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree. Steve Wilson, looking at the BBA data, I mean, he was definitely the champion and must have spent endless months of hours. It's wonderful, but I agree. There's so many questions left unanswered, and we could definitely add on a lot of information if we looked at different land holdings. Similarly, we don't look at any county or state. We don't monitor those populations, and it's always been a big question of mine if they would be consistent across management holdings, or what exactly might be going on more comprehensively with a lot of these trends.
Anybody else have any questions?
I just want to thank Alexis for a really wonderful presentation and for deepening our awareness of what specific dynamics are happening with Northeast Minnesota breeding bird populations, but also where those samples are being taken. Just a good report on this project over these last 15, 20 years. Yeah, it's longer than, I guess it's longer than that.
This is Jerry. Since I'm retired and I'm not looking for money anymore, but you should really, the national forests, both Spear and the Chippewa National Forests, are one of the few forests in the whole country that have continued to monitor their forest birds. This is not being, there may be a few other forests that are doing this across the country, but if you know any of the wildlife biologists in those places, you should thank them for they continue to fund this for that long of time. So.
Yeah, and I'll just put a plug in. If you like your research that's going on, it never hurts to write your national forest supervisor and tell them you appreciate the funds they're directing to support research efforts like this. Letters from the public support programs like this go a long ways. So write your forest supervisors if you're so inclined.
Excellent.
That's great. Thank you, Eric and Jerry. That's I second all of those things, and it is amazing, and it's great to have such wonderful partnerships and support for the bird community in Minnesota.
Well, Dr. Grinde, thank you so much for being with us, for your time, but especially for your passion and for your work and for sharing it with us.
Thank you guys so much for having me. If you ever have me again, I promise I'll go to work and be with a better internet connection.
No worries. Just to note that we will convene again on the second Thursday of March. We'll have a presentation about sandhill cranes. So we're looking forward to that as well. All right, folks. I hope you all
Thank you, everybody.
stay safe and sane out there. And we'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye.